right, so we are reading the Hound of the Baskervilles, which is probably the most famous Sherlock Holmes novel. And um, well, Walter, do you want to just give a little recap of where we've gotten to? I mean, we got the reader to the point where a man named James Mortimer, who was a doctor, had come to Holmes, not knowing what to do because it appears that the lord of an estate, the Baskerville estate, has been mysteriously killed, and the question is, do we need police or do we need a priest? Because it's not clear whether a person or a mythical hound did the crime. And Holmes has agrees to think it over for a day and then get back in touch with them. And then what happens?
Well, it's very important to understand how British society in rural areas works. This heir to the Baskerville fortune, who's died suddenly in very mysterious circumstances, could have been the victim of a curse that goes back hundreds of years to a early progenitor who was apparently killed by a dog as divine vengeance for him basically raping a woman of the countryside. And the people who come to Holmes are very concerned because this Baskerville family really is the ruling family and the protectors of this very empty, rather poor and gloomy part of England on the moors, without a lot of agriculture and with no wealth. So it's important that this family reestablish itself so that this community can go on. Now, Holmes's partner, Dr. Watson, the kind of normie compared to the neurotic, hyperacute, overly logical Holmes, goes out. Goes out. And for once, the scene is not London, as it usually is in Sherlock Holmes stories. Now it's this very stagey, moody countryside. And Watson goes out and meets everybody around the current heir. And the idea is they're going to protect this current heir who has come back from America from suffering the same fate. So it's not just a murder investigation, and it's an attempt to hold off the death of the new nobleman.
Which, by the way, is a classic PI job. Why you can't get the police to just protect you, right? But you can hire a PI to do it,
right? So Watson goes out to the countryside to, let's call it the castle or the manor house in which the Baskervilles live. And on behalf of the new Lord Baskerville, he starts meeting all the neighbors and the servants. And we get a portrait of this little sort of microcosmic feudal society in which everybody looks up to the rich protector and has their own motive, perhaps, to hurt him. We're given the possible motives of various people, and we're given a lot of red herrings, okay? We're given a lot of false trails, and reason to suspect the butler, reason to suspect the woman of mystery, reason to suspect the butterfly catching naturalist sort of local flake who runs around, collecting insect samples, and his sister, or is it his wife?
Right.
And all of the tropes of conventional British mystery are brought about, all the usual suspects and motives, and especially the motive that we don't have in America, which is who will succeed the Lord, Right. And in the midst of that,
in America, we do that though. Who gets the insurance money?
Yeah, who gets the insurance money? Well, we sort of did it with Billions, but that too is based on a kind of Anglo-style inheritance and succession to, this time a chairmanship in a boardroom rather than a lordship out on the moors of Devonshire. Anyway, after we've met everybody, And after Watson, in a reprise of the first chapter, sort of comes up with his own, he plays detective. We discover that Holmes has been investigating the same case in parallel while hiding out in a druid stone hut out in the desert there. And, so once again, we have all of the usual characters, but we've got a new wrinkle. And the new wrinkle is Holmes's intense rationality, skepticism, and hyper observant nature. And we're at the point where some real suspects have been established. I at least am. Holmes thinks he knows who's doing it, what their game is. There are more twists, and that he knows more than he's letting on. But it seems to be that it is a battle for the heart of the current occupant of the seat. They're going to defraud him into a match.
Right. Oh, right. Exactly.
And what I find distinctive, as I said earlier, over other Holmes stories is that it's not set in London. Over and over, Conan Doyle takes pains to relate these modern people, and it's 1900. They might not seem modern to you and I, but modern in their day, to the ancient inhabitants of the land. We're seeing druid huts, Holmes living in a stone cave-like structure, hounds out. It's a primitive world in which a modern mind is trying to figure out a mystery. And in that sense, I think it's one of the great detective stories because it's not just a process story in the big city. It's a process story about human nature. Are we the same creatures in some ways as these ancient people that they keep referring to?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Are we any different? Has there been progress since the day of druid priests out on the plains living in, rock homes and with their strange Stonehenge-like ruins strewn about? And this attempt to square the circle, to bring together the entire question of whether we are civilized or not, is, I think, the deep meaning of the story. And the villain, let's remember, uniquely, well, there's a couple of other Holmes stories, is an animal.
Well, allegedly is an animal.
Allegedly
is an animal. And
but how much like what we've just been talking about is that? Did the animal do it? Well, did the passions do it? Or did the person, or is there a power behind this beast?
Right. And do we know all along what's happening? Or, well, let me back up. Holmes is one of the first detectives in literature, right? Obviously,
right.
we had Poe, right, with the Murders of the Rue Morgue,
Armistead, Maupin,
right, and you could put Porfirovich. You talked about Dostoevsky before, right, with the Crime and Punishment. That is a great detective story. There's a lot of people. I'm not a huge Dostoevsky fan in a lot of ways, but he was a fantastic potboiler writer. On top of,
and the model for Columbo, the Peter Falk character.
Porfirovich was the model for Columbo.
Yep.
Wow,
that's absolutely
just
well
one
known.
more thing.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. All right. Well, so what's one of the tropes that I think was introduced by Holmes, which I think has been replicated 1,000 times ever since, is that as you're reading detective fiction, there's always two different things going on. There is the plot that you are following with everybody else, which these are the cards that are put on the table by the author, all the available facts, right?
Right.
But there is also a secondary plot where the detective, who is a hyper observant, super deductive character whose powers of observation are superior to yours has already figured this out at some point, right? At some point in the story, far before there's been a revelation, the detective begins taking alternative steps, right? It begins pursuing a second plot line, and part of your job as a reader in these stories is to try to pick up those cues and figure out when that is, and follow both stories at once. In this story, there's actually multiple levels of that. Like for instance, early in the story, they have a meeting with the heir, Charles Baskerville, and they agree to meet again at a certain time after talking about it. And then as soon as that meeting's over, Holmes takes Watson aside and they go rushing off to a hotel because Holmes has a kind of conspiracy with Watson to pursue the secondary investigation. But Watson doesn't know that Holmes is also going off into the plains with the Druids. It's just there are levels to this, right? And with Holmes, you always find out much later on that he's got it figured out about a third of the way through the story completely, if not at the very beginning, right?
And that is, how can I put it? One of the pleasures of a Sherlock Holmes story is knowing that your stream of impressions, guesses, and hypotheses is going to be most certainly wrong. You hope, because if you figured it out, then what do you need Sherlock Holmes for? And in fact, the most pleasurable Sherlock Holmes stories are those in which you find out that from the moment he met with the first person, he knew what was happening.
Exactly. And we did that with the redheaded lead. He had it figured out right away what that was all about.
Right. And everything since then has been a trap for different characters, a test of certain people, an investigation maybe more deeply into their motives. But knowing that Sherlock Holmes had you beat almost from square one is why you read a Sherlock Holmes story. And you play the game willingly, knowing you'll always lose, because the delight of seeing him win in the way he wins is that gratifying.
Here, though, one of the things that Conan Doyle sometimes does when he wants to express to you that it's a particularly difficult and confounding case, or that there's another factor that makes it emotionally difficult for Holmes, the presence of Irene Adler, who distracts him from his usual hyper awesomeness by introducing him to confusing adolescent feelings. Because Holmes he's emotionally he's 12 years old. Like, that's one of the great things about the story, right, is that
he's on the spectrum.
He's on the spectrum. He's never grown older than you will be when than you are when you're 12. But his brain has in certain ways, right? But in this case, the fact that he goes out and sets up the secondary druidical investigation tells you that he is concerned that there is a bigger issue at stake for him in this story beyond the mere solving of the mystery. That he, as you say, he's trying to get at something else, like he wants to settle in his mind some other question. Right. And I think you're right. I think the question in this story is, have we advanced? Has my hyper rational, way of doing things? Are we really in a different age?
Do we live in a magical or an explicable world?
Right. So it's very important to him that he get that question settled, because his entire belief system, the thing that makes him so fanatical and relentless, that he spends his nights whipping corpses to see how bruises get raised and things like that. He does that because he believes, like almost like a religion, that things can be detected. And what if that were not true? What if it were just magic? It's a threat to him, right? And so not only is Baskerville under threat, the heir, not only is this great house under threat, which is always a consideration in a British novel. We must preserve the dignity of the family, right? But also, it's the rational method, the advancement, and that is in question.
And are there such things as curses? In other words, there's a question as to whether freedom exists or not in this story. Because if curses exist, that means our behavior and our fates can be controlled from the outside through magical means. Or do individuals with one mind apiece have the ability to extricate themselves from any fatalistic situation? Are we free, or are we the playthings of the gods and the spirits? We just saw, I guess it was facetious, a curse placed on Charlie Kirk by this Jezebel magazine. And in reading about it, I saw a lot of religious and spiritual people going, how dare you? How dare you play with that? People taking them at their word and saying, it's not a game when you put a curse on people. Look what you did. That's because that part of the mind is still quite active. And that way of thinking and way of being is still in play in human affairs. And one of the reasons that Sherlock Holmes is an optimistic character is that he promises that if you look deeply enough into matters, you will find that we are indeed individuals capable of understanding our world, capable of guiding our fates, capable of escaping magic spells. But it's only at the very end that this is reestablished, and somewhat provisionally.
And that's also a factor. The whole question of do curses really exist? That becomes a factor for Holmes and Watson and whether they're going to be able to protect Baskerville, because they need him to disbelieve in the reality of the curse. It's crucial to the whole thing, to their whole job.
A very sophisticated point, Matt. In some ways, a new age point. What you believe to be true will come true. Therefore, if you believe yourself to be entangled in a skein of fate and kismet, it will come true.
One other thing I wanted to point out, which is that Conan Doyle is inventing really the conventions of all detective novels with these Holmes stories. I mean, think of the extraordinary number of books and stories and movies that will come afterwards that are based just on a book that's it fits in one volume, and some of them are so delightful, right, that they're repeated over and over again. So the interrogation of the hotel director and the use of intermediaries to go through hotel rooms and to search through trash baskets and get information. So early on, they're trying to find the identity of somebody who has sent a letter with little cutout words from the Times. And Holmes takes a little lad named Cartwright, and he says, "Let me have the hotel directory," said Holmes. "Thank you. Now, Cartwright, there are the names of 23 hotels here, all in the immediate neighborhood of Charing Cross. Do you see?" "Yes, sir." "You will visit each of these in turn." "Yes, sir." "You will begin in each case by giving the outside porter 1 shilling. Here are 23 shillings." "Yes, sir." "You will tell him that you want to see the waste paper of yesterday. You will say that an important telegram has been miscarried and that you are looking for it. You understand?" And his purpose in doing this is to basically go through the rubbish of every trash basket in the Charing Cross neighborhood from every hotel, because he's deduced that it has to be a hotel that this letter was written from. How? Because the pen and paper, the way that it's written, looks uncomfortable, which wouldn't be true of somebody who's using their own stationery and their own pen at home.
And they're low quality too.
And low quality.
Pen is of low quality. It runs out of ink.
Right, exactly. And so this whole convention of using the servants, the intermediaries, the hotel staff to try to figure things out. I mean, how many times do we see that? Raymond Chandler, who was, by the way, British, people forget that, invented the whole the whole language of sort of American crime fiction, or helped invent it anyway. This was one of the great tropes that he always used, was Marlowe bracing up the hotel staff or pouring out a liquor for them. But Holmes always does it differently. He always has messengers who bring the information back to him at a specific time, and he sends emissaries all across the city to collect things for him. And it's just fun the way he does it in this book.
It's what you want from an intelligence agency,
right?
Know? Yeah. And also, of all the characters in this story, which one would Walter Kirn most like to be? The 14-year-old boy who gets to be Sherlock Holmes' assistant.
They even talk about how he's looking up. He's gazing with great reverence at the great detective. Right.
But let's look at a few of the tropes, and let's quickly ask why they're so stimulating, why they're so delightful. One of the tropes in these stories and in detective fiction is that there will be a man and a woman whose relationship is not as it appears.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And look at the movie Chinatown, where we find out, that the villain is actually having an incestuous relationship with the person who hired Jake, who's his own daughter.
Right.
We're going to find out that brothers and sisters are actually married couples are actually brothers and sisters, and so on. So one of the tropes is that...
That's even in Game of Thrones, they play with that a little bit, but go ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It is that the supposed formal relationships and professed relationships between people are easily forged, okay, and will be forged. Number 2, whoever comes to you first and you forget about earliest did it. More important than anyone else.
It's like he who smelt it dealt it.
Right.
Yeah.
And always causing you at the end to go, damn, why didn't I catch that? And the reason is because it came so early and was thus forgotten so early, and you got immersed in other stuff that you didn't see the solution. And then there are, of course, the red herring tropes of, people who are conventionally suspicious, bearded people, dark-haired people, a convict out on the moors who plays a role in this story. And those play, and a good detective writer will always activate your prejudices, causing you to see that, maybe these traditional villains are the villain. But any sophisticated reader of detective fiction knows that's just fun part, and those people are never the ones who did it. Right.
But whenever there's a German mentioned in a Holmes story, I know for a fact that he's full of shit. That it's about that's there to distract me. But
right.
Go ahead.
A German with a monocle will always be suspected by dummies, but not. And then it will turn out to be like a wonderful character, a wonderful person, But so those are some of the tropes. Why are they delightful? They're delightful because they're all basically magic tricks that tell us something about how we perceive the world. That we don't see the obvious, which was what Poe talked about in the Purloined Letter. If you want to hide something, put it in plain sight. How many times have you looked for something doing your own investigative work of where your car keys went, and you find out they're in the first place that you didn't look very well and completely forgot about?
Right.
It's in other words, what detective fiction exposes are the fallacies, prejudices, and weaknesses in human perception of reality. And what the detective does is model a kind of consciousness which doesn't have the problems that the rest of us have. They are on guard from the very beginning. They don't forget anything. They aren't distracted by conventional and stereotypical villains. In fact, their bias tends to be toward looking at the most powerful and conventionally innocent people as the likely perpetrators.
Right.
There's something revolutionary about detective fiction because, like in American noir, we always find out, oh my God, it's the big boys. Oh my God, it's the policeman finds out it's the police force that's at fault.
Right. The cops are protecting Dr. Feelgood, who's protecting the heiress, right? It's all wrapped up together. There's another thing that I think is important, and there's I know that Poe was his predecessor, but I think it's important, and there's a reason why Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is the great master of detective fiction, because the detective writer must have a sense of fair play. In other words, by the rules of detective fiction, the reader must be given enough clues to figure it out, right?
They can't claim they were cheated.
It's
like it's like a magician. A magician has to give you a view into the trick that you just don't use or exploit, or you allow yourself to be distracted from. But if we find out that it's just all a big TV screen or something, that's not fair.
I recently watched a Netflix series that, didn't introduce the key plot element until episode 6. In episode 7, we're told about some weird conspiracy involving a shady company, but they don't tell us specifically what that company was, how they were being shady. That doesn't happen in a Conan Doyle mystery. He tells you everything you need to know. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And you know why people hated that, or maybe they liked it in some postmodern way, but the ending of the show Lost. Mm-hmm. The other convention or agreement between the writer and the reader of a detective fiction is that the writer knows the answer and that the detective knows the answer. In other words, I didn't just make stuff up to string you along. The Hound of the Baskervilles is not what they call a shaggy dog story. A shaggy dog story is a story that just keeps you going with a new wrinkle, but it never adds up to anything. And at the end, you just find out, the shaggy dog did it or whatever.
Right.
We expect the mechanism of the detective story to close shut in a satisfying way because it was indeed a mechanism. It was knowable. It did have a structure. We don't want to be cheated of that. A detective story is a magic trick in which the magician reveals how the trick was done every time.
And with the classic honor of a British gentleman who would never cheat at darts or I don't know, what else wouldn't they do? You know what I'm saying? Conan Doyle treats the reader with the respect that one owes, an audience that is playing fair with him, right? They're paying attention to all of the characters' foibles and all the details, and they're agreeing to do all this work. And he repays them by being fair to them, by giving them a chance. But if you read enough of these stories, as you say, there are some things you pick up on. Importantly, the requirement to be honest in detective fiction means that immediately after they tell you an important fact, you will get a blizzard of distracting details, and that comes into play rather quickly in this story, where we're introduced to, as you say, all these different people.
And if somebody seems bland on the surface, they're probably actually evil. You know, right. Whoever bored you the most, you look back at and go, oh my God, how didn't I know that was actually a psychopathic, person? It is a artifact of the age of rationalism and Enlightenment rationalism, especially in free countries, France, England, the United States. Okay. In Russia, we did have a detective, but the Russian mood is more like the movie Stalker by, what's his name? Tarkovsky, where you're led into a mysterious world and it's just never going to add up. You're going to suffer, and you're lucky if you get home afterwards. You're never going to figure it out. That's the difference between Russia and England. Like if you got home to have a drink and like climb into bed with your woman, that's the best you can hope for in this world. Mysteries, fuck, they're made not to be solved. They're made to torture us,
and what's funny about that one great mystery story by Dostoevsky is that, like Tolstoy, the answer is believe in God, right? In other words, the reason that Raskolnikov is found out in the end is because his Christian soul wouldn't allow him to live with the crime, right? And that gives him away. That's a very different kind of thing than we get in The Hound of the Baskervilles. Here, though, it's just a very interesting proposition. What could possibly be the purpose of this weird character? There is somebody who is sending mysterious letters and is trying to wind up this young heir, Charles Baskerville, who is kind of a simple fellow, right? Like he doesn't really, he mentions kind of late that he's missing a boot, and doesn't seem to have wondered at all about why that would happen, why one would ever lose one boot, right? But
you know what is important about that in terms of tropes is in great detective story, there's often a sort of simpleton, and the story is their education in how things really work. An innocent or a rube, and that allows the reader to feel superior to at least one character, while they feel inferior to the detective.
That's true. Yeah, and the Holmes stories always suffer. There's always that issue because we're trained. The idea behind these stories is that we identify with Watson, who's a smart person, brave, skilled, decent, has a loving wife. He's sexually more grown than Holmes is. So, and they have a really fun back and forth where they pick on each other. But there is a problem with Holmes being at times unsympathetic because he's a little bit of a cold fish and doesn't tell you much until the end. Yeah.
Remember when we were doing 1984 and there was an introduction by some feminist theorist who said how problematic Winston Smith was? Well, let them dig into Sherlock Holmes.
Oh my God.
Sherlock Holmes basically looks at the human race like a collection of insects in the, Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. How interesting he's Spock, he's freaking Spock. But he's also depressed too. He needs drugs every once in a while.
Once in a while, he needs them all the time.
At some point in this story, he goes out and buys a big box of tobacco, and stays up all night just smoking the whole damn box. And when Watson comes in the morning, they can't even see anything. And Holmes is like, "Oh, is it smoky in here?"
That description. And this is the last thing. I'll hang on a second. Yes. Going out, Watson, unless I can help you? No, my dear fellow, it is at the hour of action that I turn to you for aid. In other words, fuck off. But this is splendid, really unique from some points of view. When you pass Bradley's, would you ask him to send up a pound of the strongest shag tobacco? Thank you. It would be as well if you could make it convenient not to return before evening. In other words, get me a pound of shag tobacco and then don't come back personally.
Leave me alone.
Right. And so this is how he behaves towards his best friend and really his only friend. But the question, just to concretely move the story along, is why is somebody trying to convince this lord, this heir, to the Baskerville house, that this legend is in effect and that it may impact him? What are they trying to? What decision are they trying to lead him toward? And that's kind of where we're at the middle of the story. We see that Holmes is already off doing something else, but the Baskerville himself, the worm hasn't turned for him yet.
Yeah. And to solve the mystery of why Walter thinks this is an important story in a time of these big politicized dramas. And I don't want to reduce what happened to Charlie Kirk to a mere drama or some mere narrative. It's not that. It's the death of a human being, and it's a tragedy. But I want to warn people. There's a saying, keep Orwell fiction, meaning let's keep totalitarianism in books rather than in real life. Well, let's keep Sherlock Holmes fiction, because we're going to be invited to solve a bunch of mysteries soon and look at clues and figure out the good guys and the bad guys. And we're going to have our stereotypical beliefs about certain groups of people stimulated. And we're going to treat real life as a detective story. And there are others in the media and in politics and all over the place, maybe even sometimes these killers, who will invite us to inhabit the world as though it were Sherlock Holmes' story. Well, it isn't. It's your life, it's my life, it's reality, it's our family's lives. And we are easily, how can I put it? We are easily misled, brought down through the looking glass into a world where it's all about clues and whodunit and red herrings and so on. And I hate personally to see my country, my world distracted in that way by people who I don't think always wish us well, or trying to make money, get attention, get clicks, manipulate us politically, emotionally, and so on. So keep your Sherlock Holmes in Sherlock Holmes and treat each other out here like we're in an actual world of society and neighborhood and reality.
That's a great point to end on. I mean, I think one of the problems that we have now, especially in the internet age, is we have this massive population of people who have been inundated in the tropes of detective fiction, thrillers, movies, even movies like 3 Days of the Condor, right? And there are bad actors who will play on our belief that reading Sherlock Holmes or reading the Continental Op stories or the Maltese Falcon or whatever it is makes us detectives ourselves. I think you make a good point. For me, the pleasure in the Sherlock Holmes story, yeah, there's a little bit of, I would love to solve it, but you never do, really. Like, I mean, once in a blue moon. The fun in these stories is reading the prose, which I just think is gorgeous, right? Unusually in detective writers. It's very, very witty. This is one of the stories where the back and forth with Watson is like the richest. And they're always cracking on each other and all that, but also with other detective writers like Hammett and Chandler. Just enjoy it, get to the end, and then don't think you're an expert at the end of it, right? Like, that's not how it works.
Yeah, two things. Don't seek and crave the pleasure of the box finally opening in real life. You're not going to get closure. You're not going to get Aha. You're not going to get Hercule Poirot or Sherlock Holmes or Scooby-Doo pulling the mask off. Don't seek that, because it will be used to manipulate you. Your desire for that gratification and that end of suspense and end of anxiety in real life will only be used against you. And it's not possible to get it, okay? Secondly, this story reminds me of something about detective fiction that I think everyone forgets. Just like you don't remember the first character who came into the room and think of them as perhaps the big suspect. Detective fiction is really about setting. And this story in particular is more about setting than almost any Sherlock Holmes story. Sherlock Holmes teaches us a lot about London and what it was like to live there, and the stores and the tobacconists and where you get your clothes made and what it's like in the poor sections and what it's like on the grand streets. In this story, the moor, the landscape, the soil of England itself is the main character. That foggy, dark, moist, quicksand-filled, mysterious, moonlit moor. That's what lasts.
That's it. Yeah, that's a great point too, and that has survived in the British imagination forever. And they continually come back to it in modern mystery series, and this story is the reason. But anyway, thanks everybody for hanging out with us and for reading this. And we're not going to get to the end of the next one. We're going to keep plowing through and pick out some fun moments. And let's hope we get some answers by the time this show comes out. And take a breather, everyone, and we'll see you next week.